All right, let's talk about the appendicular skeleton now. As a whole, we can describe our appendicular skeleton as being the division of our skeleton that provides for movement. Okay, includes bones of our upper and lower limbs, and a total number is 126. But that number, once again, is misleading because we're talking in pairs here. Okay, the bones of our appendicular skeleton include those from our shoulder girdle, or shoulder girdles, I should say, because there's two, the singular pelvic girdle and extremities, which are arms and legs. Okay, if we broke it down into upper and lower limbs, kind of broken down like this. In the upper limb, we have two pectoral or shoulder girdles, which include the clavicles and scapula. Okay, one each side. The free part, so your arm, in other words, has 30 bones per arm. One humerus, which is the upper arm. Two forearm bones, the ulna and the radius. Then you have 8 carpal bones, those are the wrist. 5 metacarpals in your hand, and then 14 phalanges, which are the fingers. Okay, so there's 30 per arm. And then on our legs, in the lower limb, we have the singular pelvic or hip girdle. 2 bones are just hips or os coxa, kind of fancier term for them. Then you got in your free part another 30 bones. One big long bone, the biggest and strongest, longest bone of the body is the femur. Then you've got a patella on the front side of it, that's your kneecap. 2 lower leg bones called the tib and the fib, tibia, fibula. 7 ankle tarsal bones, 5 metatarsal foot bones, and then 14 toe bones called phalanges. Okay. As far as these 2 images, it's the same ones that were on the previous lecture, not anything you'll see on the exam. So we're going to go through each one individually. Now, unfortunately, since these bones are in many cases associated with motion, there's a lot to discuss with them because they've got muscle / tendon attachments, they've got joint formation structures like the scapula. You can see there's like 15 different things that you need to know about it. Okay, so some of these are going to be pretty complicated. One that's not too complicated though is your clavicles. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of highlight things and think it'll be easier if I use my document camera. Each clavicle or collarbone is slightly S-shaped and is flattened vertically and easily seen and palpated on your upper shoulder, upper thorax. Okay, palpate is just a fancy word for like felt. Okay, we all know where our collarbone is. We've all felt it. Okay, the shoulder girdle is joined to the axial skeleton via clavicle and sternum interaction. And we just saw that at the end of our last lecture between the clavicle and the clavicular notches of our sternum. Okay, here's what each clavicle looks like. Okay, and you can kind of see the S shape to it. Basically, all you need to know, aside just from being able to identify in these 2 images that it's a clavicle, are the 2 ends. Okay, acromial end and the sternal end. Okay, they're named with these ends based on what they attach to. The sternal end attaches to the sternum. Acromial end attaches to what's called the acromion, which is a structure on our scapula. Okay, the sternal end is described above as being rounded. Okay, but I think it's more described, to me, it makes more sense to think of it like more flattened, because you think looking at it like this angle here, okay, it's basically flat. Like you could almost like stand it up, like you could stand up a pin. Okay, this connection between the sternum and the clavicle creates what we call the sternoclavicular joint. Okay, whereas the acromion, meeting the acromial end of your clavicle, creates what's called the acromioclavicular joint. Okay, when somebody has like a shoulder injury, it's not always the true shoulder joint between this structure, your scapula and your upper arm, the humerus. Sometimes it's going to involve actually issue with the clavicle and either its attachment to the sternum or between the clavicle's attachment to the scapula. Okay. One of the most common football injuries is actually an AC joint separation. Okay. Very common, happens to quarterbacks when they get like sacked and they come down on their shoulder sideways. The guy lands on top of them. Okay. A lot of times this disconnects from this. Okay. Sometimes people actually can disconnect the sternum connection to your clavicle or the clavicle connection to the sternum. So it's actually an SC joint. Okay. So that's kind of misleading and something that a lot of people know. Okay. Now, we've kind of covered that. We can start talking about the much more complicated bone, one of the most complicated bones that we're going to cover, not the most, I would say, but one of, and that's your shoulder blade, what we call the scapula. Triangular plate posteriorly overlies ribs 2 through 7. And like a triangle, it's going to have 3 sides, right? Okay. Well, here in our posterior view, you can see those we have labeled as borders. We can also see them here in our anterior view. Okay. That includes what we call the lateral border, also goes by the term axillary border. I don't know why axillary is listed in parentheses here, not over here. Okay. That's the side that would be on our armpit side. That's why it's also known as the axillary border. If you think about where your humerus is, your humerus comes down right there. And so right here literally would be basically your armpit. Okay. Medial border is on the other side. Okay. It also goes by the term vertebral border. And that's because your vertebrae would be located basically right there. And then on top is what we call the superior border. And it's labeled right there. Doesn't have another name, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. Okay. It's just the upper margin. Okay. Now, the superior border comes to a point, and we can see that labeled in both images, is what we call the superior angle. Okay. There's also on the other end a point called the inferior angle. Okay. And that's just the point where the medial and the lateral borders come together. So those are kind of just the distinctive sides of our scapula. Next, I want to talk about probably its most prominent and easily described structure, what we call the spine. And I say it's easily described because you can actually feel this. So it's easy to visualize it. You run your hand on the back of your shoulder, and you're going to feel this very prominent bump coming across. And that's the spine. Okay. And we can see it nicely. I'm not actually going to worry about this image, but I did include it to kind of talk about some stuff. The spine is on the back side, but then connected to it and coming kind of more to the front, this will be the front of the body, is that structure I've been talking about called the acromion or acromion process. It's labeled here in the posterior view, but you really get a best view of it here and here. Okay. Acromion or acromion process is a flaring projection at the lateral end of the scapular spine, articulating with the clavicle once again to create that AC joint, acromioclavicular joint. Okay. Not to be confused with the acromion is what we call the coracoid process, and that's labeled here in the posterior view, but you really can't see it so well there. You get a pretty good view of it here in the anterior view. Okay. The coracoid process is like a hook. Okay. And attached to it are several tendons. For example, your biceps muscle that we all know in our upper arms, the big guns. There's 2 tendons, both of them connect to the coracoid process on your scapula. Okay. So don't confuse the acromion and the coracoid process. Thinking back to our last lecture, we talked about the mandible. In fact, I still have the mandible, and we had on our mandible the coronoid process. So don't confuse coracoid and coronoid. Not that you're gonna have to really worry about confusing those on the exam. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's also another cornoid process that we're going to find out in just a second. Okay. Now, going back to our posterior view, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Using our spine as kind of a landmark, we have a space above and below it, which are named based on their location relative to the spine. Above and below are where you find the supra and the infraspinous fossas. Okay. Supra and infra, remember, are just short for superior and inferior. Okay. These are just basically indentations where you find some muscles. Okay. In fact, literally the name of the muscle that sits right here, it's called the supraspinatus. Guess what the name of the muscle that sits right in here? Infraspinatus. Okay. Sure, you've all heard of your rotator cuff before, right? There's 4 muscles and their tendons that are going to make up our rotator cuff. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus are 2 of the 4. Okay. You can actually feel both of those muscles. So if you find that spine on your back, if you feel above it, you'll rub your supraspinatus. If you rub below it, will be the infraspinatus. Okay. They're not actually superficial muscles as much because there's kind of a muscle covering them a little bit anyway, but you can still kind of feel them a little bit. Okay. Let's see what else. Going to our anterior view is another fossa, only visible in the anterior view, and this is the subscapular fossa. Okay, it's on the front of, basically, it's just the indented front part of the scapula, and this is where what we call the subscapularis muscle is. And we're going to talk more about these muscles next unit. Okay, but that's a third muscle that is part of our rotator cuff. Okay. Next structure is what we call the glenoid cavity. You can also sometimes see that listed as a glenoid fossa. This is really nicely shown here, and this is one of the reasons I included this image. It's like a cup-like indentation. It doesn't really do it justice here, but this is really nicely shown here. Going to accommodate the very nice rounded head of the humerus, which we're going to talk about on the next page. And that together with the humerus creates the real true shoulder joints, we call the glenohumeral joint. This is what allows you to throw a ball and lift your arm up above your head. When you're reaching on your back to try to feel for the spine, you were using that joint between the glenoid fossa or cavity and the humerus. It's actually the most freely movable joint in the body. Okay. I think the last structure is the suprascapular notch. You can see it's labeled both scapular notch and suprascapular notch. Okay, I'll just make sure you know both ways. It's the same thing. Over here, it's labeled as suprascapular. Over here, it's just scapular. This is just an indentation on top of the scapula, so that's why it's called suprascapular. And that allows for a nerve to pass through. So if you didn't notice, I've highlighted or starred everything in the bottom pages. Okay, any questions? All right, let's talk about the humerus. Longest and largest extremity bone, upper extremity bone, excuse me. So it's our longest bone in our arms. Articulates with the scapula to form our shoulder, the true shoulders. And then also with our 2 bones of the forearm. And it creates essentially 2 elbow joints. Okay. So we said that there's like 3 shoulder joints. Well, there's actually 3 elbow joints. Okay. 2 of them involve the humerus. 1 of them does not. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. Okay. Let's just start proximally. We're going to go just from this rounded head, which is one of the most prominent features. And I'm just going to go ahead and highlight it now. It's a ball-like structure. that fits very nicely in that cavity of our scapula to form that true shoulder joint. So we'll start proximally and then we'll work distally down to the elbow. Okay. So thinking of it like, our total body, if you think your head, which is nice and round, just beneath our head is our neck, right? Okay. Well, your humerus actually has two necks, okay? An anatomical neck, which is an oblique groove just distal. And they represent it here kind of with these dotted lines. Whereas where it really constricts, where it gets more skinny, is the surgical neck. The surgical neck's more like where the metaphysis is. Okay? Remember that term we learned the other day? Okay. So it's the constriction just distal to the tubercles where the head tapers to the shaft. Now, speaking of the tubercles, let's highlight those. The greater and lesser tubercles. You can only see the greater here in our posterior view, but we can see it and the lesser in the anterior view. Those are important attachment sites for muscles. Okay. The greater tubercle, if you feel like right at the top of your shoulder, right at the top of your arm, you actually can kind of feel for that. Okay. It's a lateral projection, so it points laterally. Okay. Whereas the lesser tubercle, it's on the front and it just points straight ahead. Okay. So that's why you can only see it in the anterior view. It's on the front side. This is the back side. We can't see it. And it just points straight ahead. Okay. You can actually also kind of root around. You might be able to feel for that as well. Okay. In between there, kind of just maybe shade it up a little bit, is a little groove or sulcus called the intertubercular sulcus or intertubercular groove, which is a pathway for the tendon of our biceps brachii muscle. So we talked earlier about the biceps coming up and attaching to the coracoid of our scapula. Well, one of the two tendons travels through this little groove. We call it the intertubercular sulcus or groove because, as we know, inter means between. So intertubercular literally means between the tubercles. All right, so those are the structures proximally. As we start moving distally, next thing I'm going to have you highlight is the deltoid tuberosity. It's a very subtle projection, but it's very important. It's about a third of the way down. It's on the lateral side and it points laterally. You can actually see it in both images. And this is where your deltoid muscle, which is that big rounded upper shoulder muscle, attaches. It comes down from our shoulder and connects down here. That's the muscle that allows you to put your arms up like you're pretending to fly, which we do as kids. All right, not going to worry about the body or shaft or the radial groove. So we'll move down distally to where the elbow is. Okay. First thing I'm going to have you highlight, I'm going to kind of outline it a little bit. This thing always kind of looks like a bow tie to me. We call the trochlea. Okay. Trochlea, kind of see it a little bit here in the lateral or the posterior view. That structure is where this bone, our humerus, meets what we call the ulna. Okay. And that creates the true elbow joint that allows you to flex the guns, to straighten your arm, to bend your arm. Okay. That's what we would call the true elbow joint. Okay. What's called the humeral ulnar joint. Okay. Well, laterally, there's also a rounded knob called the capitulum. And the capitulum is where the radius interacts with the humerus. And that's like the lesser elbow joint. It's not the real true elbow joint. It's the joint because it's two bones connecting. Okay. Now on our anterior view, above the trochlea, it's really not shown very well in this picture, but there's an indentation, almost like a little pocket, called the coronoid fossa. Okay. In the back side, a really deep pocket is the olecranon or olecranon fossa. Okay. These two fossas enable the ulna, and I'll kind of just jump ahead. Here's what the ulna looks like when you look at it from the side. Okay. It has kind of a U shape to it. These two little points, one fits here, one fits here when we flex our elbow and when we lock our elbow into a straightened position. And I said lock it in because they fit right in there, and that's going to help keep that elbow joint really nice and secure. In fact, your elbow is one of the most secure and stable joints that we have. Okay. And it's because of that interaction between the coronoid fossa and the ulna. Okay. Last two structures I want you to highlight are the medial and the lateral epicondyles. The medial and lateral epicondyles are bumps on the side of the bone. Okay. Well, if you look at the difference, the medial is quite a bit more pronounced than the lateral. That's an easy way to tell it apart. If you can't just remember that the medial is bigger, go back up here, find the head. The head's rounded sides always medial because it has to point into the shoulder, right? Okay. Well, you know that this has to be medial, so you know that this side of the bone is medial. Okay. You can feel this. This is a very prominent bump on the inside of your elbow. You can feel the lateral as well. Okay. Attached to the medial epicondyle is a special important ligament called the ulnar collateral ligament. Attached to the lateral epicondyle is the radiocollateral ligament. Those run down from your humerus and attach to the ulna for the ulnar and to the radius for the radial. Okay. We're going to talk more about those things in the next lecture on when we get into joints. So don't worry about the radial fossa that's labeled there. It's really just too subtle to really worry about it. Okay, any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So when somebody's double jointed in their elbows, are there the joints or they just need to never fall down?
So we'll talk more about double jointedness in our next lecture. But an elbow is a pretty common site where somebody has that, condition, or I guess I'll say it that way, of being double jointed. Somebody that's double jointed they don't have twice as many structures. This means that their joints are a little bit more flexible. They're a little looser. They might not be as stable. So that's kind of a downside to it. Being double jointed, you're more bendy, but you're also probably at greater risk for being, hurt because your joints aren't just as, secure, I would say, as somebody that, is not double jointed. All right, in your forearm are two bones and a ligament. We don't have a picture here at the bottom that shows it, but it is there, I promise, what we call the interosseous membrane. Okay, the interosseous membrane is basically just a membrane. It just goes like this down the length of those two bones, just helps hold them together. Okay, once again, inter means between, osseous is just a fancy word for bone. So interosseous membrane is just a membrane between bones. Okay? Just helps secure them to one another. Okay. The two bones are the radius and ulna. The radius is on the thumb side. Ulna is on the pinky side. If you think about anatomical position, you would know that the ulna would be what? Medial or lateral? Try again. Medial, because remember, if you're in an anatomical position, your palms are facing forward, which means your pinky is on the medial side. Okay, radius therefore is lateral. Radius is thumb, ulna's pinky. Okay. Now on the exam, you might just have to identify the two bones individually. So go ahead and highlight those. Between the two, the radius is quite a bit simpler. It gets its name because of its kind of disc-shaped head. Okay, it's kind of like a wheel or a tire. Okay, and if you were to turn the page sideways, you kind of look at it. It kind of looks like a wheel. In fact, it works just like a wheel, in that it spins. Okay. We all know that, you can have your palms facing forward, but you can also move your palms facing backwards, right? Okay. What that radial head does, it fits right in this little notch of the ulna, and it will allow your radius to spin right here. But what happens down here is this will end up on this side, okay, which is really cool. And so when you, what we call pronate, which is where you move your form posteriorly, okay, the spin takes place here, and then this side ends up flipped over at the other side. And so that's the head of the radius. Okay. Next structure of the radius I want you to highlight is what we call the radial tuberosity. It's a little bump, very nicely shown on the anterior view. Okay, attachment site for the biceps brachii muscle. Don't worry about the neck. Final structure of the radius I want you to highlight is what we call the styloid process. The styloid process is this little point. Okay. Now our ulna also has a styloid process. Okay. You can feel these if you feel like right where you would wear your wrist, or where your watch on your wrist. You feel on the sides, you should be able to feel two bumps. Okay. If you're feeling on your pinky side, that's from the styloid of your ulna. It's on the thumb side, it's from the radius. Okay. What these do is they kind of wrap around your wrist bones. Okay, 4 of the wrist bones. Okay. Now look at the size of the radius here versus the ulna. Okay. Your wrist is really more of an interaction between the radius and those carpal bones that we'll talk about. We won't get to that today, but we'll get to that next time. Okay. So your radius is a lot more involved with the wrist. It's not so involved back up at the elbow. Okay. Well, the reverse is true for the ulna. The ulna is a lot more important at the elbow, and then it gets smaller at the wrist. So they kind of flip. Radius gets bigger, ulna gets smaller as you go distally. Okay. Now let's talk about the ulna, which is the bone that once again articulates with the humerus to form our true elbow joint, and that articulation between the humerus and the ulna occurs with what's called the trochlear notch. And that trochlear notch is what this structure is right here. And I'm not going to worry about this image on the exam, but I did want you to know it just so you can kind of see what that trochlear notch looks like. Okay. If I go back to the previous page, we learned that little bow tie is called the trochlea. Guess what fits right in and around that trochlea, the trochlear notch. Okay. So basically, you think of it like this is the trochlear notch, here's the trochlea, this is what they do. Okay. And then when you move your wrist, this is what's happening. Or move your elbow, excuse me. You bend your elbow, you straighten your elbow. Okay. That's what the trochlear notch is. Now, these 2 points that I talked about, okay, this bottom one is called the coronoid process. That point right there, guess where it fits? Coronoid fossa. So that's what happens when we flex our elbow. Okay. When we extend our elbow, that point there, what's called the olecranon. Focus. The olecranon fits right in there. So that's why they're named the way they are. Okay. Now that olecranon fossa, or excuse me, process, it's basically all of this, which includes this point. Okay. That point is the point of our elbow. When you put your elbow on a table, when you feel that knob on the back of your elbow, that's what you're feeling. Okay. The olecranon or olecranon process. Okay. Let's see. Last couple structures I want you to know. Do want you to know that radial notch I kind of mentioned earlier, that's the notch where the head of the radius fits in, creating that ability for our radius to rotate and spin. Okay. And then also what's called the ulnar tuberosity. Just like the radial tuberosity, the ulnar tuberosity is attachment site for the biceps breakout muscle. And those are basically in the kind of same general spot when you put them together. You know, radial tuberosity be like right here, ulnar tuberosity be right there. So any questions on these two bones? All right, we will stop here. I want to pick up a new slide because we've got several bones left to discuss on this next slide. So we'll start with the wrist, the hand, and the finger bones on Thursday.